The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they've been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is author Randolph Cameron, the author of Finding a Way to the Top. And we all want to get to the top, and you wrote this book to help young African Americans, executives and so on, find their way to the top. What motivated you to write this book, since this is a very, very important issue?
Right. Well, Dr. Brown, I tell you, I've had some help in my lifetime, and one of the really outstanding mentors that I've had in my lifetime, a gentleman by the name of D. Park Gibson, gave me my first leg up, and that caused me to want to share some of the wisdom and insights that I discovered as I went through my career.
Well, D. Park Gibson is a legend in the African American business community. This was 30, 40 years ago.
That's
he
correct.
led the way, and because of the culture of African Americans, where we've been so much involved in service and professions, it's only recently that it's, by recently, the past 30, 40 years, that the techniques of moving up the corporate ladder have been exposed to the African American community. And you wrote this book with the intended purpose of helping young black executives or encouraging them, or both?
Both. During my career, I had an opportunity to work in corporate America for about 13 years. I worked for the Avon Corporation, and in fact, I was the first African American director in the history of the Avon Corporation, in an organization that was about 86 years old when I joined it. And what I observed during my experience there was the fact that there were a number of very bright, well-educated African Americans, both male and female, going through what I call the revolving door. They would come into the corporation in a relatively short period of time, they would exit the corporation.
Now, was that due to prejudice or lack of skills or lack of awareness? Or all three, again?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question, because that's part of the thesis of my book. What I have said in effect in this book is that many young people, African Americans and other minorities in particular, or women, for example, who also represent a minority in organizational America, may fail at their first and second attempt to be successful in the organization. And they will fail not because they lack the technical know-how or perhaps even a sound education, but they will fail because of their inability to negotiate organizational culture. And so my observation over the many years that I've been in organizational America is that it is the culture or the lack of knowledge of how that culture functions that causes people to go through that revolving door.
Now, sociology describes culture as the milieu in which particular groups of people live and work.
Right.
You talked about the culture of corporations. Could you describe a little about what you mean about the culture of a corporation?
Absolutely. I think that every organization has its own culture, and I define that culture as values, traditions, folkways, the way we do things around here. And it's that the way we do things around here that really impacts on the young person who is trying to work their way up the ladder.
Now, you suggest that this is for African American young people, but don't white young people have the same issues? Maybe not as much because of race, but are they the same issues, or is it tougher for African Americans and Latinos?
Well, many young white executives or young people coming into organizational America are faced with very similar obstacles. The difference often is in the access to coaching or the mentoring. That seems to put the African American at a significant disadvantage. And so without having that mentoring, networking, coaching support group, it is more difficult for the African American to find their way to the top.
And that's why finding the way to the top is the mentor for many African American young people. Because in writing this book, you've clearly identified the issues. And then you get very specific, ranging all the way from resume preparation to seeking the job, as to how to relate to rejection, how to present yourself, how to deal with the culture, how do you deal with your colleagues, a whole range of things that I think would be very helpful, which those of us who've been in bureaucracy and organizations sort of take for granted. But they are not for granted for many African Americans because they have not grown up in families where this has been part of the culture of the family. The boss's son of a major corporation has a better chance than the chance of somebody who's a transit worker, for example. So tell us about some of those skills that you think are the most important. I don't want to put you on the spot as to which one is the most important, but let's talk about the group of those that are most important.
Right. Well, I'm glad you asked me that. I have spent many years observing this activity that goes on in organizational America, trying to analyze it and reduce it to some points of wisdom, if you will. What I identified in my book are a number of key indicators of things that I think can make a difference. For example, one section I talk about the 7 noble truths. And what are these 7 noble truths? One, for example, is the right attitude. Attitude, there's really no substitute for an appropriate attitude for trying to establish yourself in an organization. And the second is the right dress. A lot of people challenge that and want to know, well, why do I have to subject myself to a dress code? But it is part of, again, the culture of the organization. And I think if a person wants to know, well, what is the appropriate dress code, they have but to look around the organization, in particular the individuals who are the decision makers in that organization, to determine exactly what that dress code is about. I speak about the right prose. That's important. We live in a society where the written word is very, very important. And so your ability to write is critical in that operation. One poorly written memorandum, letter, report could cause you some serious trouble in your career. The ability to speak, critical in the process. Presentation skills. For whatever reason, in America, we are greatly influenced by what I call Hollywood, and that is the ability to to present a kind of show business approach. And so those people who present well, make good presentations, tend to be favored over those who have difficulty in standing up in front of a group and presenting. Time management is a critical piece. And so some of us want to feel, well, I'll get there when I get there. And that's really not how it works in organizational America. In organizational America, for example, we equate time with money. And so if you're stealing my time, you're stealing my money. And that's basically how it works. The right politics becomes a critical piece in it. And so the ability of African Americans to be able to understand what the politic of that organization is all about. By politics,
you're not talking about a Republican Democrat. You're talking about the interaction with the power systems in that corporation.
Absolutely. I'm talking about in every organization there is a body politic, and it is the thought, it is the wisdom of the organization, how things should happen, who should in fact experience success in the organization and why, who should be the spokesperson, all kinds of, who should mind the money, that kind of thing. And so if you understand how that politic works, it becomes an easier opportunity for you.
There's something called organizational psychology.
Right.
And that's, in a sense, what you're talking about when you said the first of your 7 major points was attitude. Attitude has to do with whether you understand and accept the psychology of the organization and are willing to subjugate some of your own views in order to move ahead. Now, some people are so independent they can't work in a corporation. They don't want to work in a corporation. They don't want to subjugate their attitudes and their ideas to a corporation. What do you say to young people who said, well, I can't do this. Why do I have to give up my value? Why do I have to smile when I don't like what they're saying? What do you say to somebody like that?
Well, I say that it's okay. I feel that God gives us choice, you know, and so no one should work in an environment that they really don't want to be in. In fact, we spend so much time in our daily work that to spend a lifetime in an activity that you don't really want to be in or don't enjoy or can't contribute to, I think is a great mistake.
What about the trade-off for money and power? Some
Well,
people will take money and power as a trade-off for not liking the attitude.
You can't have it both ways. I say this, though, there are different ways to acquire money and power and recognition. Perhaps the individual should go into business for themselves and become an entrepreneur. In that way, they get an opportunity to set the culture. They can determine how we do things around here, so to speak. And that's important. A lot of people do that. After working in an organization and they get an education, they make mistakes there on somebody else's money, so to speak, they decide, hey, what I really want to do is run my own business. And it's fine. It's the American culture. It's the American way. It's an opportunity to own a piece of the rock.
Now, many African Americans who go to business schools and others end up in organizations, social service organizations, governmental organizations. Do some of these principles apply just as well to a social organization or social service organization and to government? How does it vary there?
Absolutely. I teach a course at Medgar Evers College and have taught there for the past 11 years. The course is entitled Organizational Behavior. And so I have a good deal of research into this whole area of profit and nonprofit and governmental. It's all basically the same, with some minor alterations, but for the most part, a lot of the basic issues one will find in corporate America, nonprofit America, government, military, and I've been in all of them. I've been in the military, I've worked for the government, I've worked for nonprofit America, I've worked for corporate America.
Now you focused on the word, prose, speech, presentation. Is that a natural attribute or is it an acquired attribute? How does one address that as they're trying to climb this corporate ladder?
Yeah. Excellent question. I maintain that there is no substitute for excellence. It's something that you are either gifted with, that is to say, some people are just born with certain skills.
Not born, they grow in an environment.
Well, they grow into, all right, that's true, that's true. But they have certain abilities that are kind of natural. But others are acquired, and so we have to work for them. And what I recommend to young people, if there are certain skills sets that they need to sharpen, that they need to develop, need to hone, they need to go to school. Universities and colleges are in business for that. But they need to take the
right courses. They need to take courses that involve a lot of writing, because you take courses where you don't do writing and only do speaking. You take courses where you don't do either. So how do you get them to recognize that and to take advantage of those opportunities?
Well, there's no substitute for practice. And this is my third book. Incidentally, I did not ever think or imagine that I would write a book. But my mentor, D. Park Gibson, was a public speaker, outstanding, and a writer. And so I observed him and I said, if he can do this, I can do this as well. And through practice, I mean, if one wants to be a writer, you simply write. You know, you write all the time. And over a period of time, you will develop some really good skills.
Well, some people have good writing skills, but don't have good speaking skills. How do you develop speaking skills?
The same thing. There is no substitute for practice. A basketball player, if he wants to be a good foul shooter, he has to spend an inordinate amount of time practicing from the foul line, shooting that ball in the basket. A runner who wants to run the marathon, and Dr. Brown, you have ran the marathon, I know, a number of times. You know what it's like to train for that and to practice. There is no substitute for it. The human ability to accomplish things is incredible if you have belief, if you have vision, and if you're willing to put in some hard work. It'll work.
Clearly that has worked for many, but many African American youth go to poor school systems. They don't have role models. They are just dealing with day-by-day survival. What can we do collectively in society to raise the level of expectation of our youth, to raise the level of their educational experience? That's a key issue, because it isn't just the individual, it is the society. And if the society says we don't make it easy for poor people, for immigrant people, for Latinos, for African Americans to move up the scale because we don't want that competition, what do we say to them? How do we change that society?
Okay, I think, first of all, we have to care about our young people. That's important. The idea of writing this book was a give back for me. I said, look, I was helped, and so what am I going to do in my lifetime to make it better for someone else? There's no substitute for that connection and that sense of obligation.
How did you get that?
Well, it came through my parents. I was blessed in the sense that I had two parents that, while they weren't wealthy, but they did care, and they raised three boys in Harlem. And as you know, going back in the 50s, it was not easy to do that. A lot of the young people who came along during my time went to prison, were on drugs and things of that nature. But that influence from my parents was an important concept. And then basketball, sports was an important element for me. And I did play high school basketball, went on and played college basketball, and then was exposed to a lot of outstanding people like yourself in college who let me know that I could achieve as well. One of the great speakers that I heard at my college was Dr. Leon Sullivan. He came to my college, and prior to that time, I had not heard a person with that kind of oratory. But again, coming back to your question, I do some work, some consulting work for the Children's Aid Society. And we have some programs there at the Children's Aid Society that I think really speak to the question that you raised about how do we help our young people. One program is a volunteer program, in which case they call it SisterNet. And this is a program that brings outstanding professional people from the judicial system, from nonprofit America, from corporate America, and they come and counsel and work with young girls and help them, bring them to their jobs and expose them. We have a counterpart to that is a group called Hoop Brothers, and you have young professionals who come play basketball with the fellas and then counsel them and coach them, take them to sports programs and things of that nature. So, and these programs are not unique in the sense that it's not happening around the country.
Just that there are not enough of them.
We need more.
We need more.
We need more.
That's very clear. Now, you, in your conversation, talked about the role of sports. Sports is one of those activities that doesn't really depend on how you write or how you look. It depends on what you do on the field, the court, the diamond. It also brings you into competition on a fairly equal level where race doesn't count, economic status doesn't count. To what extent can we use sports more? Because right now so much of sports is, are you going to get a pro contract? But the more important thing about sports is the Randy Camerons of the world who got that interaction, got that motivation. How can we use sports more effectively in this mechanism?
Well, I feel that sports plays a very important role in our life skills. It goes beyond a career. I think that for a person to have a successful life, they need to look at a holistic approach to it. That is mental development, spiritual development, and physical development. And so for me, as an example, I have utilized physical activity through sports. I don't play basketball today, but I do run and I do walk, things of that nature. My daughter is done the 3rd marathon, so we have encouraged her to do that. And I think physical condition is a critical component to the success of an individual's life. The opportunity to meet people who are highly successful and who are willing to help you through this networking, mentoring relationship happens in sports all the time. Many people in sports would not be successful if they had not utilized this opportunity. So I encourage sports as a means to success in life.
Now, what do you think the secret is to a young person developing the right attitude toward their career, toward overcoming obstacles, toward getting ahead? What is the secret to developing that attitude?
Well, I can only guess. Okay, I can't say that I can speak for everyone, but there are some bits of wisdom that I have identified, and one is the notion of developing self-esteem and belief. There is very little a person can do if they have low self-esteem and they don't have belief in themselves.
But suppose they're in an environment that does not reinforce their self-esteem. How can they develop that self-esteem when everyone around them is saying you can't do it?
Yeah, I think you have to outreach to people who have it. As I said, I was blessed in that I had a mentor. And I actually stumbled on to D. Park Gibson, who I worked for 10 years. I started as an intern and studied this man. And he reached back and gave to me. So it's a chain effect. If you don't have access in your family, then it could be in your community center. It could be in your high school or college. But you have to open yourself and trust someone who has this and they can work with you and develop you. I don't know of any other way.
I know some of the people in the religious field say it's a spiritual thing. In one way, some people say God helps those who help themselves. Yes. Now, how do we bring our larger black community together to help young people aspire to more? Because unfortunately in some of the schools, when a youngster tries to do good schoolwork, they say you're acting white. And even the corporate say, you're acting like the white folks. How do we remove that shibboleth? Because that clearly isn't true. What are some of your suggestions for that?
Well, there is an issue, I think, that one has to come to grips with around the spiritual question. Because a person's spirit, and I'm transcending organized religion per se, but the spirit of the individual is critical in terms of surviving and thriving in any kind of environment. I maintain that this statement or the saying that some young people have where they say you're acting white is really kind of a cop-out. That's my take on it. And I say that because no matter what community or what environment or what country that you go in, there will be certain rules and regulations. Some of the rules will be written and some will be unwritten. And you will have to observe those rules and regulations and find a way to successfully negotiate them. I don't think being a good reader or being a good speaker is acting white. I just don't see that. We now have women emerging as presidents of countries in Africa and in South America. I don't think it has anything to do with them acting white.
But what about the role models that are shown in the videos and the music and so on, which, as Moynihan said, defines deviancy down? Some people say that's part of our culture. How do you respond to that? Because that culture, that genre has brought lots of money and fame to people, but it tends to send a message, or is it a message that could be translated into a positive frame?
Well, I think there are all kinds of cultures, if you will. One, as I said, in business, there is a culture, and you have to observe and respond to that culture. If you're talking about a community, in which case perhaps people who are not interested in a professional lifestyle, they have formed a culture. So what culture are you really buying into? What is it that you want to achieve in life? Mm-hmm. And if that is important to you, then how do you effectively negotiate that culture? How do you embrace it? How do you develop a lifestyle in that culture? But there are all kinds of cultures. There's a drug culture, there's a criminal culture, and you have to ask the question, do you want to buy into that culture?
Well, clearly, if anyone wants to find out how to get away to the top, reading Randolph Cameron's book, I think, would be a good way to do this. I want to congratulate you on the book, and I'm sure a lot of folks are going to read this and help to move to the top.
Thanks
you very much.
Thanks
for Randolph Cameron for being our guest on today's African American Legends.